And we're back. We're picking up with India under British rule and starting with the East India Company. Pardon me, guys, still a little under the weather right now. In the 18th century, the Mughal Empire was defeated and its capital sacked by Iranian armies. While internally, the Mughals' deputies had become de facto independent rulers of their states as the central power had collapsed. There were several turning points in the relationship between India and Britain, which led to British control. British control of India was helped by the elites. Because Britain was unable to compete with the woven textiles in India, they continually deindustrialized the country, ending the cotton industry and forcing India to export raw cotton. This led to increased unemployment. New technologies, especially in transportation, also dramatically altered Indian-British relations. British, French, and Dutch companies were staffed by ambitious young company men. And these were established in trading ports in strategic places, and Indian troops were hired to defend them, and these troops were called sepoys. By the early 1800s, the British East India Company had pushed the French out of South India, forced the Mughal Empire to recognize company rule over Bengal, and had taken control of large territories that had become the core of the Bombay Presidency. The British reign, or the British Raj, over India aimed both to introduce administrative and social reform and to maintain the support of Indian allies by respecting Indian social and religious customs. Before 1850, the British created a government that relied on support military power. They disarmed the warriors of Indian states and gave free rein to Christian missionaries and established a private land ownership system to ease tax collection. At the same time, the British bolstered the traditional power of princes and holy men and invented so-called traditional rituals to celebrate their own rule. British political and economic influence benefited Indian elites and created jobs in some sectors while bringing new oppression to the poor and causing the collapse of the traditional textile industry. Discontent among the needy, and particularly among the Indian soldiers, led to the Sepoy Rebellion of 1857. And a leading cause of this rebellion, aside from the horrible treatment of the Indian people, the destruction of the economy, and the oppression of rights, in addition to all of that, was a total disrespect of Indian culture. The two major religions in India, as you guys already know, are Hinduism and Islam. And within these religions, there are certain products that are not consumed. In Hinduism, beef is not eaten, cows are sacred, and in Islam, pork is not eaten. And the cartridges that were given to the sepoy soldiers were greased with the fat from a pig or a cow. And the soldiers were told to bite off the end of the cartridge, but that went against their religious beliefs. When they complained about this, their British superior officers completely ignored them. The Sepoy Rebellion of 1857 is also called the Indian Mutiny of 1857. And although it began among the sepoys, some 200,000 Indian soldiers who served the British officers actually joined in by the end. And although the rebellion was suppressed in 1858, it gave the British quite a shock. And after the revolt, many British began to doubt that the Indians could be educated and assimilated into British culture. Racial stereotyping by the British became even more pronounced, and social Darwinism also led to more tension between the English and the Indians. The Indian rebels were hampered by their inability to unify behind a single cause. With the end of the revolt, the British Crown seized direct control of India. Some British officials believed in equality of Indians and British, and others actually supported and believed that regardless of ethnicity, Indians and British should have equal rights. Those Indians who had been westernized felt particularly alienated by the new colonial government's prejudice against Indians based upon their ethnicity. As India was taken into the British Empire, India was given the nickname, if you will, the jewel in Victoria's crown. And Victoria, Queen of Great Britain, became the Empress of India. After the rebellion, the British eliminated the last traces of Mughal and company rule and installed a new government administered from London. The new government continued to emphasize both tradition and reform, maintained Indian princes in luxury, and staged elaborate ceremonial pageants known as durbars. And these pageants really just took smaller aspects of culture and made them incredibly ostentatious and blew them completely beyond what anybody had experienced before. An efficient bureaucracy, the Indian Civil Service, or the ICS, now controlled the Indian population. Recruitment into the ICS was by examinations that theoretically were open to all, but in practice, racist attitudes prevented Indians from gaining access to the upper levels of administration for a couple of different reasons. One is the location. The exams were in Great Britain, and you would have to cross the ocean to get there. And that prevented a lot of people from taking the exams. After 1857, the British government and British enterprises expanded the production and export of agricultural commodities and built irrigation systems, railroads, and telegraph lines. Freer movement of people into the cities caused the spread of cholera, which was brought under control when new sewage and filtered water systems were installed in the major cities in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The failure of the rebellion of 1857 prompted some Indians to argue that the only way for Indians to regain control of their destiny was to reduce their country's social and ethnic divisions and to promote a pan-Indian nationalism. An example of this Indian nationalism was by Rama Roy. He attempted to assimilate European culture with traditional Indian culture. He studied Sanskrit, but also wrote in Arabic, Persian, and English. Roy led a movement to try to reconcile India's religious traditions with Western values and to reform traditional abuses of women. He promoted a reformed version of Hinduism, which returned to classical Hindu beliefs with social reforms, including the banning of sati, polygamy, and child marriage, as well as restoring property rights to women. Roy was part of the Bengal Renaissance, and British liberals encouraged Roy and the Renaissance to continue and to grow. In the early 19th century, Indian intellectuals tended to turn toward Western secular values and Western nationalism as a way of developing a pan-Indian nationalism that would transcend regional and religious differences. Indian middle-class nationalists convened the first Indian National Congress in 1885. The Congress promoted national unity and argued for greater inclusion of Indians in the civil service, but it was an elite organization with very little support from the masses. The English encouraged the building of railroads across India. Indian nationalism was also encouraged by a growing middle class. The first leaders of the Indian National Congress were wealthy men who promoted the interests of their own social class, and the Congress was particularly sensitive to the growing racism of the British, which often excluded Indians from private clubs. The British argued that their presence in India was necessary to keep the Hindus and Muslims from fighting each other. The British also promised good government and improvements to Indian lives. However, in 1896-97, the monsoon rains failed, and the British failed to move foods to famine areas. In 1905, Britain decided to divide up the northern province of Bengal in the partition of Bengal. No Indians were consulted, and this angered them, understandably. This created a predominantly Muslim province in East Bengal. Indians claimed that the British were trying to divide the Indians by religion, and the partition of Bengal provided a rallying point for Indian nationalists of diverse economic, educational, and religious backgrounds. The partition of Bengal provided a rallying point that would unite almost everyone. And in 1906, during the anti-partition protests, Mohandas Gandhi returned to India. At the same time as Gandhi's return and the protests, many Indians were leaving India for other parts of the British Empire. The British defeat of French and Dutch forces in the Napoleonic Wars allowed Britain to expand its control in Southeast Asia. They established a series of strategic outposts in Southeast Asia. Raffles established the Free Port of Singapore in 1824. Assam was annexed to India in 1826 and Burma in 1852. Malaya, Indochina, and northern Sumatra followed, falling to the British, French, and Dutch, respectively. And I want you to take a moment just to look at the map here and see what areas are being controlled by which European powers. And perhaps importantly, which ones are not. The development of new ships and shipping networks contributed to the colonization of Australia and New Zealand by British settlers who displaced the indigenous populations. Portuguese mariners sighted Australia in the early 17th century, and Captain James Cook surveyed New Zealand and the eastern Australian coast between 1769 and 1778. Unfamiliar diseases brought by new overseas contact substantially reduced the population of the hunter gatherers of Australia and the Maori of New Zealand. Australia received British convicts, and it became a penal colony. But after the discovery of gold in 1851, a flood of free Europeans arrived, as well as some Chinese settlers. British settlers came more slowly to New Zealand until the defeat of the Maori. Faster ships and a gold rush brought more British immigrants after 1860. The British Crown gradually turned governing power over to the British settlers of Australia and New Zealand, but Aborigines and the Maori experienced discrimination. All right, again, so Asia in 1914. So taking a look at who is controlling what. If you need to pause this to kind of, sorry, this is not the best picture, to zoom in and see who is controlling what areas, take a moment. That's okay. Hawaii and the Philippines. By the late 1890s, the U.S. economy was in need of export markets, and the political mood favored expansionism, aka imperialism. And the United States annexed or stole the Hawaiian Islands in 1898. Now, let me tell you a little story real quick before I move on, just to give you some background of actually how the U.S. got Hawaii. Queen Liliuokalani was reigning over Hawaii, and Hawaii was an ideal location for American farmers to grow certain types of fruit as well as sugar. And to avoid having to pay fees for the land in Hawaii, as well as bringing the products back to the US, these businessmen and plantation owners essentially lied to the US government and said that they were attacked by the people of Hawaii and the US needed to send reinforcements to save their lives, which was all completely untrue. But the US government also had an interest in taking Hawaii, and this was the excuse they needed. So, US comes in, takes Hawaii, and as you guys know, Hawaii would eventually become a US state. Now, I like these two pictures at the bottom because if you're looking at a world map like this, oh, look, Hawaii and the Philippines, they're an entire world away. They're really not. It's all about perspective. We can talk more about Hawaii in class if you would like. But for now, the Philippines. Emilio Aguinaldo led an uprising against the Spanish in 1898. And he might very well have succeeded in establishing a republic if the U.S. had not purchased the Philippines from Spain at the end of the Spanish-American War. Again, nobody asked the people of the Philippines. In 1899, Aguinaldo rose up against the American occupation. The U.S. suppressed the insurrection and then tried to soften its rule by introducing public works and economic development projects. And after introducing some measures of self-government, the U.S. announced in 1916 that the Philippines would become independent. But it took until 1946 for that to happen. We're going to stop for today. This will be our last slide, and then we're going to move on and discuss Mexico the next time. The U.S. had long held interest in Cuba, and American businesses had invested in Cuban sugar and tobacco production. When Cubans began a revolution against Spanish rule, the U.S. ultimately aided the Cubans against Spain. But After defeating Spain in the Spanish-American War, the U.S. took over Puerto Rico, while Cuba became an independent republic subject to intense interference by the U.S. The natural resources of the Latin American republics made them targets for forms of economic dependence called free trade imperialism. That is, free trade imperialism. British and U.S. entrepreneurs financed and constructed railroads to exploit the agricultural and mineral wealth of Latin America. Latin American elites encouraged foreign companies with generous concessions because this appeared to be the fastest way both to modernize their countries and to enrich the Latin American property owning class. The U.S. often used military intervention to force the small nations of Central America and the Caribbean to repay loans owed to banks in Europe or the U.S. The U.S. occupied Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, Honduras, and Haiti on various occasions during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The U.S. was particularly forceful in Panama, supporting the Pan American Rebellion against Colombia in 1903 and then building and controlling the Panama Canal. All right. Like I said, we're going to stop here for today. We'll pick up with our final podcast tomorrow on revolution and civil war in Mexico, as well as the results of a global economy because of imperialism. If you have any questions, send me an email. You know the drill by now. Otherwise, have a great night, guys. Cheers.